Welcome to the 1611 Defense Podcast. My name is Kyle Kiker, and glad to have, I guess we can call you a guest, Brother Sluder. You've been on here a few times. Good to have you today.
Good to be back.
And today we're talking about the history of the English Bible. And Brother Sluder, tell us about how you've gotten into this sort of thing.
Yeah, it kind of just came from, I've always loved facsimile copies of anything, and particularly the Bible. I've always loved studying the history of the English Bible specifically. I've dabbled in like the history of the Spanish Bible. And so I always liked having facsimile copies of stuff, just older books. And I was able to kind of get involved in like getting facsimiles of this, that, or the other. And it kind of expanded into a whole project where our church now has these facsimile copies of every English Bible from Wycliffe all the way to King James with some other languages and different things added in there. So that's how we got involved with it. A lot through the Tennessee Bible, exclusively through the Tennessee Bible Museum, is where we've been able to work with them and get a lot of things for our history of the English Bible display.
Wow, that's a blessing. Super excited to do this. Brother Knupp and I did some podcasts. We did 5 on the Pure Line, and that was, I think, episodes 6 through 10, something like that. And we breezed across some of this stuff, went into detail some, but I'm glad we can do this to give our listeners an opportunity to get it in more of a condensed version.
Sure.
Because not everybody wants to listen for
7 hours.
4 or 5 hours, however long it took us. So with that being said, first up is the Wycliffe translation. Now, if you will, before we talk about that, give us a little bit of the background leading up to the 1300s when Wycliffe, what's the setting that Wycliffe was in when he went to do this?
So Wycliffe was a Catholic priest. Now, I believe he was a born-again Catholic priest. He is called the Morning Star of the Reformation. He technically would be considered pre-Reformation era, and he is coming in. I call it the Satan's millennium, right? From about 500 AD to about 1500 AD. It is 1,000 years of what they call the Dark Ages, and it's called the Dark Ages for a reason. And the Catholic Church ruled. Satan had his millennium, okay? And so Wycliffe comes in at the tail end of that. The climate of where Wycliffe is at with England, it's completely Catholicized. The people are there's no Bible in the English language. You have earlier things going on, like, for example, 1175, you have the Wessex Gospels, which was written in Old English, Beowulf type stuff. You couldn't read it. So he's coming into this. There's no printing press yet, so we'll get into that. But he's coming into a time where having a Bible, barring the fact that it could cost you your life,
right?
Having a Bible, which technically they added those edicts after John Wycliffe. But not only was it like kind of edgy to have with the Catholic Church, but it was just expensive.
Sure.
You just making books then, there was no printing press. So it would have taken them, it took the average scribe 10 months in a scriptorium to make a Wycliffe Bible. One hand, because everything was done by hand. So that was kind of the climate that he was in. There was a lot of religious fervor at the time surrounding questioning the Catholic Church because of the Lollards. A lot of people think that John Wycliffe founded the Lollards, but there's a lot of evidence that shows that he found them, he didn't found them, if that makes sense.
Well, just, looking at it from a church history standpoint, a lot of times people that are like-minded, even though they may be segregated due to geography or whatever it is,
right,
they have a tendency to find each other.
Right.
And
that's probably what happened. More than likely, when you look at the evidence, the Lollards were already in full swing, and Wycliffe found them, they found each other, whatever.
So, if you will, pause right there and tell us who the Lollards are, because not all of our listeners are going to be able to just pick up on this.
The Lollards were a Baptistic group in England during the time of Wycliffe, prior to that. And they, without going into the whole Baptist history, succession or whatever you want to call it, even though we don't believe in succession like some of our Baptist brighter brethren would, there is this line of beliefs, and the Lollards were simply one of those groups. They were a Baptistic group. They would have been lined up very much with what we would call the Baptist distinctives. And so they were a group, and they latched on to Wycliffe's Bible because they were street preachers. They traveled around, and they were very wise in their evangelism, but they were saved individuals, born again believers who fell into that category of being in that Baptistic line.
What are the Baptist distinctives?
B is, so it's the acrostic, right? The acrostic that a lot of people are familiar with. Baptist. B, Bible's final authority. A, autonomy of the local church. P, the priesthood of every believer. T, the two offices, pastor and deacon. I, individual soul liberty. S, separation of church and state. And T, did I add the P in there? Did I forget the P? The priesthood of every believer. B, so Bible's final authority, autonomy of the local church, priesthood of the believer, two offices, individual soul liberty, separation of church and state, and two ordinances, Lord's Supper and baptism.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool. I just wanted you to tell that just so everybody knows.
Yeah.
So my chair's squeaking back here.
It's okay. It's well used.
Yeah. Well used, maybe not well oiled, but well used.
That's right.
So the thing about it is Wycliffe put out this translation of the Bible, and where does it fall in line with the English line of Bibles that precede the King James?
Right. So it is the first full English Bible that we know of. It is in the line, and this is where a little bit of the debate comes into. The official historical record, right, is that he got it from the Latin Vulgate, Jerome's Latin Vulgate. There are some Bible believers who tend to think that it came from the old Latin, the old Syriac, and that's possible, right? But the majority of it, what we have, so what I have is a 1395 Purvey edition. So after Wycliffe passed away, one of his guys went through and revised some of it. That's where the theory is that some of the Jerome's readings got in there. So but it's very obvious that like what we have here, and if you read, so like for example, if you'll hand me that Bible, it says Wycliffe Bible right there. Yep, right there, Wycliffe Bible. Yep.
Yep.
You can go through. So I got this off of Amazon. This is the Wycliffe Bible, but it's just in modern text. It retains the same spellings, readings, and all that. It's just very difficult to read something like this. Beautiful Bible, by the way. But it's just difficult to read that. So you can go through and see where this does indeed match Jerome's Latin Vulgate. But the whole line of purification, right? Of like, well, the English Bible, the King James is the 7th Bible. Well, technically it's the 8th, but this would not come from what we would consider the Textus Receptus line. This would come from a line, a family of manuscripts. Some would call it like the Western family or whatever. But this would come from, this would not come directly from the Textus Receptus. The Textus Receptus hadn't been invented yet, right? Erasmus did it in 1516. So that's where some Bible believers have a discussion on, well, this is an English Bible, but doesn't fall in the Textus Receptus line. So therefore the King James is the 7th Textus Receptus Bible. This one doesn't count, so forth and so on.
Well, the flow of Greek manuscripts hadn't happened yet because Constantinople had not fallen yet.
That's exactly right.
That was another, 70 years later.
Yeah, 1459, I think is what it was.
I think it was 53.
53, yeah.
Anyway, whatever it was about 70 years later.
Yeah.
So with all that being said, the Wycliffe translation took a long time to make, 10 months. And how was the people's reception to the Wycliffe translation?
Oh, people loved it. It was widely received. It was, you're battling, illiteracy rates at that time, obviously. So not everybody could read it, but it was a huge deal. Again, this Bible is what sparked the Reformation. And although we would have some political and obviously theological problems with Protestant Reformationism and all that kind of stuff, this is what sparked that. This was the embers that lit the keg
Yeah.
of the explosion of the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah. One thing about Wycliffe is obviously he was one of the most learned men of his time.
Yes.
And Wycliffe was a professor.
Yes.
Okay. And I believe it was Oxford where he was at. And so Wycliffe had access when studying the Bible. That's one of the things that got him into it, knowing that the people needed the scriptures.
Yeah.
Because at the time, everybody was hung up on papal superstition.
Absolutely.
And all the foolishness that comes with that, with transubstantiation and all the crazy stuff that they believe. Babies, if they're not baptized, going to hell, and all the nutty stuff that came from the church fathers and Augustine, which he was one of the church fathers and all that.
Right.
So the scriptures have a way of enlightening people. And one thing I want to add in there is Bill Bradley in his book, I believe you got it under there.
I've got it right here. Yeah.
He talks about how, I don't know how often this happened, but that people would congregate after working in the fields and stay up through the night, listen to the Bible
Listening
read,
to the Bible being read, absolutely.
and then got to go back to work the next day because it was such a rare thing. Supply was low and demand was high.
Yeah, I mean they would have public readings of the Wycliffe Bible. The Lollards, would set up and sometimes it wasn't even like a street preaching, it wasn't even a sermon. It was just people reading the Bible, and people would just come and listen for hours on end to somebody read the Bible to them, and it was the Wycliffe Bible.
Yeah, and Lollards were known as babblers.
Yeah.
Then, but they were the people that the Lord used with Wycliffe.
Right.
Wycliffe put out the text, and the Lord used the Lollards to disseminate it. And talking about a light shining in a dark place, the morning star, if you will, morning star of the Reformation. If you will, brother, before we move on, explain, if you will, in Revelation chapter 2, or is it chapter 3? I think it's chapter 3.
With the Church of Sardis?
So the morning star in that connection with Wycliffe.
Yeah, so that's the Church of Sardis in Revelation 3. And I will, so for anybody, just to kind of go through a quick synopsis in case you don't know, we believe that the 7 churches represent 7 church ages, right? And so Ephesus would correspond to the Apostolic Church, Smyrna, the persecuted church.
Yeah. In
typology. Yeah. So these churches, there's these interesting similarities between these churches and church history when you lay them out consecutively. So Pergamus would be the beginning stages of the Catholic Church. Thyatira would be the kind of the reign of the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church heyday. And then you have the Church of Sardis, which is characterized by the Protestant Reformation. And one of the blessings, one of the promises given to the Church of Sardis is, I will give thee the morning star.
Yeah.
And with Wycliffe, the Lord sure did. If we're looking at church history, I'll give thee the morning star, in Wycliffe being called the morning star of the Reformation.
Yeah, that was Thyatira, but at the end of it.
Oh, excuse me, Thyatira. Okay, yeah. Thyatira. So yeah, Thyatira, the end of it, because that's right, because John Wycliffe is still in the age of Thyatira, the Catholic Church. He's pre-Protestant Reformation. And then it gives birth, the next church in the line, it gives birth to Sardis, the Reformation, the Church of the Reformation there. And that's Revelation 3.
Yeah, I think this will be a good segue into Gutenberg, which is our next up. Were you done with...
Well, no. So one more quick thing about Wycliffe. So, like we just said, he comes in right at the tail end of Satan's millennium, right? And the Catholic Church realizes they're beginning to lose a hold over the people because the Word of God's now in the common language. As a result of that, John Wycliffe's already dead. They dig up his bones, they burn his bones, and they throw them in the river Swift. There's a papal decree that goes out that states that you cannot put the Word of God into any language except for Latin. It has to be in Latin. You can't have an English Bible. You can't say your prayers in English. You can't do anything in English. It all has to be Latin. Okay? What's interesting is they threw his ashes in the river Swift, And the idea that what people were saying is his ashes went in the River Swift, which the River Swift ultimately winds up into the ocean, and his influence spread around the world from that.
Yeah.
And so the Catholic Church burned his bones, and it's kind of like Joseph's bones were not left in Egypt. Well, John Wycliffe's bones were not left in England. They went all around the world.
Yeah.
So
yeah, he died of natural causes.
He died of natural causes. He sure did. And then I can't remember exactly how many years later.
I think it was, I don't want to say because the podcast has got to be exact, but it was 1420 something, because he was buried in the churchyard of Lutterworth, in Lutterworth, England.
Where he was a pastor.
And they dug him up.
Yeah.
And anathematized him, or however they did it.
Yeah.
So Revelation chapter 2, this is church at Thyatira, and this kind of foreshadows the Dark Ages in large part. Because Pergamos, you've got marriage, much marriage, which is the Catholic Church marrying the nations.
Yeah.
And so that kind of, the way I learned it, and different people have different datings for this, but it kind of runs, pretty much parallel, depending on who you read after.
Mm-hmm.
But if you take it with Thyatira being 500 through 1500, Pergamos would be 313, with Constantine coming on the throne through 500. But at Thyatira, and unto the angel of the church in Thyatira write, these things saith the Son of God, who hath his eyes like unto a flame of fire, and his feet are like fine brass. And basically what the people did in the Dark Ages, they preferred the Pope over Jesus Christ.
Absolutely.
And that kind of sets that out. And so it talks about knowing the works and charity, and there was some good things that the Catholic cult did. Mm-hmm. So some of the monastic works with hospitals and things like that. There was some charity there. But anyway, it talks about thou sufferest that woman Jezebel. And anyway, it's an interesting study. Not going to go through all that.
And we'll talk more about that when we get to Tyndale.
Yeah.
About how there are people that preferred the Pope and his thing over Jesus Christ himself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that, of course, there was definitely popes in history that claimed to be Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one of them that said he was the way, the truth, and the life.
I didn't know that.
From John 14:6.
Well, they call themselves the vicar of Christ, and the vicar that means the substitute. We believe in the vicarious atonement of Christ, which means Christ took our place. He was our substitute.
Yeah.
And so they call themselves the vicar of Christ, which means the substitute of Jesus.
Yeah. And one thing that y'all will find, that everybody finds that looks into it with an open mind, or I guess that Lord lets see this, is that in the history of the English Bible, one thread that you have all the way through, with the exception of the Douay-Rheims, is everybody's anti-Roman Catholic.
Right.
Maybe not Catholics, because a lot of people, are held in superstition and darkness, but the hierarchy of the catastrophe that's been in Rome all this time. So anyway, now so it says to finish this up, Revelation 2, it says, he that overcometh and keepeth my works unto the end, to him will I give power over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron, as the vessels of a potter shall they be broken to shivers, even as I received of my Father, and I will give him the morning star. Mm-hmm. And of course, you've got the literal interpretation of that, but this typology that we're talking about with church history,
right? That
was Wycliffe's moniker.
Yeah, it was a weird coincidence.
Coinky dinky.
Yeah.
So let's move from here and let's talk about the printing press. So we got 1382 with Wycliffe. 1388, Purvey comes along and edits it.
1395.
Well, you've got the 1395.
Yeah, I've got. Oh, yeah, I've got the 1395.
Yeah.
Then Wycliffe, then you have the Gutenberg. The Gutenberg Bible. It came in 2 volumes, like you see here. First printed book in the world. It's the first book to ever be printed. If you look at how meticulous, it was a lot easier than handwriting, right? But if you look at how each character had to be carved and set, it still wasn't an easy process, but it sure was easier than writing. It took 10 months to do one copy, like we said with the Wycliffe. So now all of a sudden, 1455.
Sorry.
That's okay. There is Johannes Gutenberg creates the printing press, and it completely revolutionizes what's going on. So you have these texts. We mentioned the Wessex Gospels. We mentioned the Wycliffe Bible. But now all of a sudden you have these Bibles, the Gutenberg Bibles, being able to go out in that time what's considered mass production. Okay, it's kind of like a little hidden revelation in there in the book of Psalms. The Lord gave the word, and great was the company of them that published it. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, now we're able to publish. And so Gutenberg created the printing press, and I don't have the exact quote, but you can look it up, but he basically makes the printing press, and the purpose that he gives is that he talks about, just imagine what's going to flow, the words of God that'll flow from this to the masses. And that was the reason why he invented it. And the Gutenberg Bible was from the Latin Vulgate. It was done in German, obviously, and it was, you talk about the Protestant Reformation. Of course, you have the Luther Bible. This was what helped spark that flame in Germany, because Martin Luther comes along. Less than a century later, 70-something years later, it maybe even 60-something, and he has access to this Bible, obviously. But he takes it not from the Latin Vulgate, but from Erasmus's Greek text. So what you see this shift, and this is an interesting note to point out, especially with like the Wycliffe and the Gutenberg Bible. They both come from quote unquote Catholic sources, if you wanted to get technical. I know the earlier Wycliffe, there's debate on that coming from the Old Latin, like we mentioned, but these are English translations, translations that are not in Latin, which the Catholic Church doesn't like, but they're still from the Latin Vulgate. So you see this shift happening after the Gutenberg, that now we're not dealing with, thank God they're in our language. Yes, they're sparking these things, but now there's this shift not only away from the Catholic Church, but away from the Catholic texts.
Yeah, and Erasmus really was the one that laid the egg that Luther hatched, as the saying goes.
That's right.
But Erasmus, in his Greek and in getting his Greek, and we'll talk about Erasmus here in a minute. So if anybody doesn't know who Erasmus is, we'll talk about him. But having with Greek being the original language of the New Testament, mm-hmm. okay, and the Greek scholars being in Constantinople, and then when that was overran in I looked it up here because I couldn't remember, May 29th of 1453. That's right around the same time that the Gutenberg Bible came out. The press was 1440. Mm-hmm. And so 13 years later, Constantinople falls. And so the Lord's got all this stuff, however it happened, yep. All this stuff has happened simultaneously almost, in a sense that it's all coming together at the end of the 1,000-year domination of the Catholic cult. Mm-hmm. And so I found that interesting. So now, in order to get the Bible to us that we have today, the authorized version of Scripture, it needed a way to get published, like you said, and it needed to have the right text behind it.
Right.
And so both those things happen within about 13, 14 years of each other.
Yeah. And you can see, if you just look at from a purely practical perspective, if you just look and see when these things started gearing up, and then how quickly things started accelerating, it's almost like a snowball effect.
Yeah.
Wycliffe creates the little snowball, and he rolls it down the hill. Gutenberg kind of gives it a shove, and then all of a sudden you've got this snowball effect of Bibles, and then if you look, 1382 is the Wycliffe Bible. All right, then you don't have another English Bible until 1526 with the Tyndale New Testament. So that is 100 and I'm so bad at math, 100, over almost 150 years, but then from Tyndale to the King James is less than 100 years. But look at all the information that's packed into that, and we'll get there when we get there.
Yeah.
But it's this, the bigger the snowball got, the faster it moved.
And we don't know what the future holds, but you take all how that wound up, and then the revivals that came after the King James Bible, and now that snowball is unwinding.
Right.
Back to Rome, and with the apostasy of the body of Christ. And I think, my opinion, and I hope this is it, that thing is going to terminate with the rapture of the church, and then obviously after that is the tribulation kicking in. So we're close to getting out of here.
Yeah.
And I know that's a totally different subject, but I thought about that talking about this. So we've got the Gutenberg print and press Gutenberg Bible. So now we have Erasmus Greek New Testament.
Yes.
And so we've been talking about English Bibles, and now we're going to talk about, well, it's Greek and Latin.
Right.
But tell us what's going on with Erasmus. Tell us a little bit about his background, if you will, and where he fits in with the history of the English Bible.
Okay. So Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam. I always like quoting his name because it sounds so funny. You know a lot about Erasmus. You did a whole study on it at our King James Bible Conference, which was great. Erasmus was, again, a Catholic priest who I believe was probably born again. He was smart. The children of the world are smarter than the children of light sometimes. He was a traveler. He liked expensive stuff. He had a taste in expensive stuff, and he would get people to sponsor him. And one of the arguments that I've heard about Erasmus's text by James White even is, Erasmus dedicated his text to the Pope. Yeah, because he didn't want to get his head chopped off. He didn't want to be burned at the stake. So,
yeah. And he knew he could get money possibly.
And he knew he could possibly get money. So Erasmus in 1516 gets the first Greek New Testament that correlated together. Because he did a Latin one beforehand. Actually, what I have here is his Greek and Latin together, like a parallel.
Called a polyglot.
A polyglot, that's absolutely right. Multiple tongues, multiple languages. And so it's a side-by-side. And Erasmus basically puts together what we now call, it didn't get called that until 1633, the Textus Receptus. The Elzevir brothers coined that term in 1633. But it's what we would call now the Textus Receptus, the received text.
Yeah, and that text goes all the way back, way before Erasmus.
Absolutely.
But Erasmus is the guy that kind of got the manuscripts together and put it in a single edition.
That's right.
So, that I've heard that or seen it, heard it before. That didn't come till 1633. Well, what about the Hesychian text? Or some of the other names for the Alexandrian text didn't come till 1795.
Oh,
I forget which name that was.
Yeah.
So that text wasn't around till then. It's the thing about, we don't know. The thing about the Alexandrian cult, they live on half-truths.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So back to Erasmus, if you will. Tell us where he fits in, how he connects from Gutenberg to Tyndale.
So the way that he fits in from Gutenberg to Tyndale, and like we talked about with Gutenberg, it comes into this thing of not only are they getting away from the Catholic Church, they're getting away from Catholic texts. And even though he had already done a Latin Bible beforehand, and nothing wrong with the Latin language. That's one of the, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin was written above the cross. But the New Testament was primarily written in Greek. So he puts out this Textus Receptus Bible. Again, I know it wasn't called that at the time, but it was the same family, same line of manuscripts. And he comes out with several editions of it, and there's a lot of really interesting studies in the editions and different editions in 1 John 5:7 and 1 John 2:23 and so forth and so on. But this is what sparks the avalanche if we talked about a snowball, that might be a good terminology, but really, with the English, an avalanche of English translations that came out after Erasmus's Greek text, because it was so easily accessible. And not only did he start this thing with the English translations, but he also started all these folks in the 1500s doing their own Greek texts that come from the same source and the same line of manuscripts that were also known as TR Bibles, or TR New Testaments.
And people talk about Erasmus being Catholic.
Yeah.
He never left the Catholic Church, so to speak.
Right.
But he was a horrible Catholic for Catholic standards. Mm-hmm. The Index of Forbidden Books, his New Testament was on that. Mm-hmm. Okay? None of the Catholic Bibles use Erasmus Greek text.
No.
Okay? But the Protestant Bibles, if you will, okay, did. Mm-hmm. And another thing about Erasmus was a soul winner.
Yeah.
And that's not something you hear very much.
Well, especially not out of a Catholic.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. And that can be found in the Essential Erasmus by a guy by the name of Doan, D-O-A-N, page 15. It says he was concerned with winning others to piety and to Christ.
Mm. Well, Wycliffe never left the Catholic Church. Wycliffe died a Catholic.
Because he disobeyed Catholic law. But yeah.
Who? Wycliffe?
Tyndale.
No, Wycliffe.
No, okay. I started to say, I'm sorry, I got mixed up.
No, you're good. No, I'm referring to Wycliffe. Wycliffe died a Catholic.
Yeah.
Of course.
I'm sorry, I got mixed up. You're talking about Wycliffe. I was trying
all the internet trolls will get a hold of that one now. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
No, he never, of course, his church there was rogue as all get out because they believe the Bible, but he died a Catholic. So again, it's kind of like the things of, I heard a quote by Brother Gene over at the Bible Museum, and it was a great statement because we went through the tour again over there. I took some folks over there and been through it, and he was talking about Erasmus and Wycliffe, and he made the statement. He says, now if these people were saved, they were saved in spite of their church, not because of it. And he said in the old adage of not all Catholics are bad and not all Protestants are good. So which has a lot of truth to it.
Oh, yeah.
And when you're studying this thing about the English Bible, God kind of takes the wise in their own craftiness, and sometimes I can even refer to guys of our stripe, because God used a bunch of Catholics and Calvinists and so forth and so on, things that we would not agree with and shouldn't agree with.
Right.
But God used those kind of men to help give us what we have right now.
Yeah.
So the Lord can do and use who He wants to.
He used Balaam's ass.
That's right.
And sometimes he uses us here and there.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
He uses you a lot more. I mean, he uses you a lot, and every once in a while, maybe me here and there. But the fact of the matter is He's not relegated to somebody who is got all their I's dotted and T's crossed.
That's right. He doesn't have anybody asking anybody's permission about it either.
Yeah. So Erasmus had 5 editions, 1516, 1519, 1522, 27, and 35.
And this is actually a 19 edition, 1519.
Okay.
What I have here.
Yep. So that would have been a second one. The first one is the one he dedicated to Pope Leo X. And so anyway, he in 1522 is the one. Of course, we're not going to talk too much about 1 John 5:7 because we don't have time.
Right.
But that's an interesting study, and I think, well, we'll see when the Lord doesn't come back beforehand. We may end up having to do a podcast on 1 John 5:7. I think it'd be fun. Maybe get Randy Keener in on it.
Yeah, he'd be good.
Yeah.
The whole thing about if you can show me one Greek text, I think they've determined that was like a myth. That's not accurate.
There's a lot that could be said about that.
Yeah.
So anyway, Erasmus also had access to the Vatican manuscript.
Erasmus did, and Erasmus had correspondence with a guy where they sent him. If I remember correctly, because I did the podcast or the presentation on it. I go with the podcast. You have to be accurate because somebody will nail you. But it was a lot. It was like a list of over 300, if I remember correctly, of readings from the Vatican text, which is the Vaticanus. Am I getting that right?
I'll find it probably after we leave Erasmus.
Yeah.
But it's somewhere on here, I think. But yeah, he had access because Erasmus, being a Catholic, you know, and not getting out of it, everybody knew he was maybe the most brilliant man of his time.
Right.
And so everybody wanted to be in good with Erasmus, and Erasmus wanted to be in good with people that had money, so that they could finance his, you know, his works and stuff.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting way that played out. But yeah, he got his manuscripts from different places. He was he was very good at making notes when he would go to visit all these libraries and stuff, because he would travel. And so when he knew of all these, and I don't know how many, but he knew of a lot of the variant readings that people talk about, and could make notations on them. Even though when he went to translate, he didn't have a ton of manuscripts right there with him. He had his notes from where he had perused tons of material in gathering for his translation. And we say that because that's one of the things that people attack Erasmus with, is saying he had a few late manuscripts.
Yeah, and that's...
Late meaning dated late.
Dated late, right. And that's where, you know, I pointed out in our conference when I did my presentation on the Vatican text, the Vaticanus, which means the Book of the Vatican. You know, that people say, man, these poor King James translators, these poor Protestant era, you know, Protestant Reformation era, you know, translators, they just didn't have the access to the readings. If only they had access to what we have access to now. And the problem is there's a lot of these readings, they did have access to them. They just rejected them.
Yeah.
They didn't want them. So it's not like that they were, you know, missing out on this important piece of the puzzle that nobody had seen until the 1800s. No, they had access to these readings.
Well, here's the thing they say. So they say he had, one accusation that they make is that, well, Erasmus dedicated his first edition to Pope Leo, I think it was, to a Pope Leo X or something, okay, to the Pope. So that's one of them. Another one that they say is that he had just a few late manuscripts. And so we already talked about the Catholic part. Yeah, it was Leo. They talk about the Catholic part. The thing with the text, with his editions that he put out, though he may have had a few late manuscripts, the text is very, very old. And the Alexandrian cult, when I say that, that's scholarship that doesn't like the King James Bible, or the Bibles that precursed the King James Bible that came before it, okay, preceded it rather. What he had, the text was old, even though the manuscripts were late. And even people with Bengal and similar, and people that were within the Alexandrian cult, have made those distinctions between the internal age and the external age of a manuscript. The external age being
the date of
it, and the internal age being the text.
Right.
And then that same crowd, the crowd that followed them up to today, will make those accusations against Erasmus, totally disqualifying the differences that their own Alexandrian cult forefathers have made. Because they're deceptive and they're liars.
Right. It's like if I take a brand new piece of paper and write down John 3:16 out of the King James Bible. The external date is very young.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's brand new. The internal date is quite old.
Exactly.
And they use a reverse logic when it comes to the manuscripts. For example, last 12 verses of Mark. All right. They say, well, those aren't in the oldest manuscripts. But you do find them, you find Irenaeus, I believe it is, quoting verse 19 of Mark 16.
Oh yeah.
You know, so it's the whole thing about the age of manuscripts and all that. You got to look back and see not just when the manuscript came from, but what is it saying? When did that come from?
Yeah.
Can we find it quoted by quote unquote early church writers, early church fathers, as a lot of people call them? Well, yeah. So, okay, so that means regardless of how old the piece of paper is, that reading is that old.
Oh, now 1 John 5:7's back in the mix.
Right.
All right,
we're going to get off topic. We're going to get off topic.
Rabbit hole, a very deep rabbit hole.
One.
So we've got Erasmus. Now we've got Tyndale, and I want everybody to notice the difference in size between all the Bibles we've held up here and the Tyndale Bible.
Right.
Tell us about it.
So this is a Tyndale New Testament done in 1526. And this is actual size. You can see it's a facsimile copy. Wouldn't have had the nice gold hue around it or the bonded leather here, but it would have been this size, and it would have had a very similar look as far as it had a leather cover. So this is a good representation of what it would have been. William Tyndale was a brilliant man, and he was basically responsible. He was called the father of the English Bible. And what he did is we were talking earlier about the Catholic Church and how that a lot of Catholics and popes specifically would rather have the Catholic Church and the papal laws than they would have the Lord Jesus Christ himself. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of summed up and culminates in the story where William Tyndale is in the house of a man. He's tutoring his kids.
Sir John Walsh.
Yep. And he's debating a Catholic priest. They're going back and forth at the supper table, and the priest says, "We would be better without Christ. We would be better without God's laws than the Pope's laws." That's what he said. And Tyndale gets infuriated, and he says, "I defy the Pope and his laws." I'm not going to get this exact, but he says, "There are many days should God let me live, I shall make even the plowboy to know more Scripture than thou dost." And so William Tyndale, that's what sparked William Tyndale in his journey on putting a Bible in English. And that prophecy, quote unquote, of the plowboy knowing more than a priest, well, that's come true. You go to any Sunday school class of a Bible-believing church, you go to the teen Sunday school class, middle school Sunday school class even, they're going to know more Bible than a priest does.
Yeah, I just listened to an interview that was on a very popular podcast. Mm-hmm. And he was being interviewed, and hearing his responses, I was like, man, this guy's supposed to be a clergyman. And you could tell he knew his seminary education that he had at whatever Catholic school he went to. But it was, when it comes to the Bible, Catholic priests are very deficient in Bible knowledge.
Absolutely.
100%. Very, very deficient. So anyway, go ahead. I interrupted.
No, you're good. So William Tyndale does his translation work in Germany. He flees to Germany for safety. Obviously, Luther is already doing his gig there in Germany. And so you have Tyndale's New Testament. They send him down the river, and they smuggle him into England over the sea there. And what's interesting is they are sending these Bibles in. Now, this is done under King Henry VIII. Right? Mm-hmm. King Henry VIII at the time is against the Tyndale Bible, right? He's against it. He doesn't like it. They're smuggling these Bibles in. They're putting them in false barrels. It's wild when you look at it, some of the barrels that they have. They would fill the barrels up with Bibles, then they would either wrap them in like burlap and seal them up that way and then hide them within the very grain itself, or they would put false bottoms on the barrels. They would fill up the Bibles to a certain point, then put a false bottom on it and fill the rest up with grain. And so, different ways to do it. But they were getting the Bibles in, and they would go down and they'd pay off some of the the port workers and different things, and grease their palms a little bit, and the Bibles would get in. And so they were flooding England. Well, there was this huge backlash from the king over this. And he went on a rampage. They burned these Bibles. There's different stories that, circulate. One of the stories is they were burning people and starting the fires. They would stack the Bibles around these people, the Tyndale Bibles, and would burn them. And they would take those Bibles and, one story is one of the martyrs grabbed up one of the New Testaments and started preaching out of it while he's burning. Different things like that. And And so this Bible was hated, but this Bible was so influential. See, a lot of people don't realize one of the biggest accusations that the King James gets, well, the King James is written in Old English. Well, that's, not only is it not true, but it's like it either shows you're a complete liar or you're completely ignorant. Yeah. It's not even remotely true. The King James Bible is not written in Old English. Things like the Wessex Gospels, that was Old English. Yeah. Like we mentioned before, Beowulf, you can't even read it. The Tyndale Bible, the Wycliffe Bible was not even written in Old. That was 1382. Right. That wasn't even written in Old English. Yeah. That was written in Middle English. Right. You can pick out a few words. It still had that Germanic sound to it, and pronunciation and reading. Like father is fadir. Right. Fadir. So you have different things like that, but you can still pick out some things in the Wycliffe Bible. But the Tyndale Bible, modern English is a thing at this point. Okay, this is considered modern English. The King James is considered early modern English, and you have phrases. I've got a few pulled up here, but here's some things that is specifically credited to the William Tyndale Bible, the New Testament here. All right. Well, in all of it, because later on there came a different guys that helped out finish the Old Testament. But Jehovah's a word that comes from the Tyndale Bible. Passover, atonement, scapegoat, mercy seat, which is a literal translation of Luther's German word, Gnadenstuhl. I don't know what that exactly means. All right. Showbread, right. Huh? Right. Yep. Phrases like "Let there be light," "The powers that be," "My brother's keeper," "The salt of the earth," "A law unto themselves," "Filthy lucre," "It came to pass," "Gave up the ghost," "An eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth," "Asking it shall be given you," "Broken-hearted," "Eat, drink, and be merry," "Fight the good fight," "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak," "Signs of the times," "Where two or three are gathered together, they made light of it." There's all these popular phrases that even enter into our common vernacular. A drop in the bucket is another one I know that's not on the list, but I know that a drop in the bucket, everybody knows what that means. Mm-hmm. So Tyndale really lays the groundwork. And I know there's different percentages that different people give, but it's some 85 to 90, 95%.
I've heard as low as 82 and as high as 90, I think.
Right, exactly. So, depending on who you ask, who you're reading after, some of the dates and some of the percentages kind of get a little fuzzy depending on who you're reading. But let's just be conservative. 80%, right, of the William Tyndale New Testament makes it into the King James Bible.
Yeah.
So that is a testament. Of course, the story. William Tyndale comes back from Germany. He's in England. He's betrayed by a so-called friend. He has a Judas that gets a hold of him, and he's put there in prison. I think he's there for 500 something days, if I remember that right. But while he's there, he does the New Testament, but he also does some parts of the Old Testament. I think he does the book of Jonah. He does. I'm going to struggle to remember all the specific books that he did, but he does some of the Old Testament, and then he's put to death. He's taken out and he's burned. He's strangled. He's strangled alive.
Which was supposed to be kindness as opposed to being burnt.
Right, it was supposed to be kindness. But they tied him to a stake. They strangled him. He's strangled there. They think he's dead. They light the fire. The fire kind of revived him, kind of, woke him back up, so to speak. And the last thing he says, and this is Fox's Book of Martyrs, that guy, Fox, he's interviewing eyewitnesses that were at the execution. And his last words were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." That's William Tyndale's dying words before he's burned alive.
Right.
So, and what's wild about that is often we'll quote, things about man, and we'll hold up our King James Bibles, and God answered his prayer. And that's true to an extent. But a lot of people, and what I love about this study of the history of the English Bible, is a lot of people don't realize the King James was not the first part of that fulfillment of that prayer.
Right.
Because King Henry VIII is the one that officially put him to death. Then you have let's move on.
And King Henry VIII was about as consecrated as
That was a godly man.
as Jezebel.
Godly man.
Ahab, I don't know.
He divorced all of his wives because they didn't pray enough. Didn't he?
He definitely liked women a lot, and
yes, he
was
did.
not satisfied with only one.
No.
He had to change them out. But of course,
I've often said if it wasn't for divorce, we wouldn't have the Protestant Reformation probably, and we wouldn't have a King James Bible.
Well, I say change them out. So when Henry VIII wanted a divorce, he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. That happened in 1533.
Yeah.
Okay, and so I know we're going to be talking about Coverdale and Thomas Matthews and all, but when you have a religion, okay, a denomination, you need to have a text that goes with it.
That's right.
All right. So the Roman Catholic cult had the Latin Vulgate, Jerome's Latin Vulgate, throughout the Dark Ages as their text. And so when Henry VIII marries Anne Boleyn, and then you have the segregation of him from the Catholic Church, even though Henry VIII was pro-Catholic, he thought a lot of the Pope. He was very popish. King Henry VIII was, but he wanted his divorce. And so, all that being said, when the Church of England gets founded, which is just basically, as the joke says, a Catholic that flunked his Latin, when that denomination gets going, they need a Bible. Okay, so we've been talking about Tyndale. What comes after Tyndale?
So what comes after Tyndale is the Miles Coverdale Bible, the Coverdale Bible, and Bill Bradley, in his book Purified 7 Times, really nails it right. The chapter title for Miles Coverdale is Miles Coverdale, the Unsung Hero.
Yeah,
and that really is an accurate title for Miles Coverdale. A lot of people don't even, like if you're talking about early English Bibles, the Coverdale Bible is kind of like one of those Bibles. Everybody knows about the Great Bible, the Chained Bible, the Tyndale New Testament, the Wycliffe, the first one ever, the Bishop's Bible, the Geneva. But it's kind of like the Coverdale, in my brain, is one of those that are just kind of left out. It's left out a lot. Not a lot of people know about it. Miles Coverdale took Luther's New Testament and took, portions that he had done of the Old Testament, and then he took like Martin Luther's Bible, he took some Anabaptist works, and he took the Itala Bible, and he basically formed together what's now called the Miles Coverdale Bible, the Coverdale Bible. It is a continuation of Tyndale's work. Bradley, in his book here, he says that the Itala Bible used by Miles Coverdale is also a Baptist text. So it included Baptist works. It included the Swiss text of the Anabaptist. So this is where the Coverdale Bible is a really when you read the text of it, it's just an interesting work. He followed in that same line of thought with William Tyndale. This was also the first Bible, 1535. This was the first complete printed Bible. Miles Coverdale does the exact same thing Tyndale does, yet never dies a martyr's death. He's spared from all that.
Exactly.
He has to flee for his life on three separate occasions, but he never dies a martyr's death. So this Bible was what I would call a go-between. Obviously, on the scale of in order, it's a go-between, obviously, but it really kind of segues from William Tyndale, burn at the stake, right, to what you have with the Matthew's Bible and then the Great Bible, because this is the first printed one. So now it's like a thing of, okay, we can have a complete Bible in English being printed on a printing press. And that really started changing the tide, like you had already mentioned, with the Anglican Church coming into existence. what happens is now they say, well, you know what, we hate the Catholic Church and we hate their Bible too. Now, they hated it for all the wrong reasons, obviously. Yeah. But that's where it comes into play of, okay, Miles Coverdale has his first printed Bible, and now you have this Anglican Church thing going on. So now, like you said, they've got to start figuring out what they're going to do with the English Bible. What are they going to do now that they're apart from Rome? Now that they're not under these papal decrees of having an anathema if you translate a Bible into English. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, well, it had to be, there's a lot that could be said about the break with King Henry VIII and the founding of the Anglican Church or the Anglican denomination. But yeah, there had to be a Bible with it. And so tell us, so we've got Coverdale that basically takes Tyndale's stuff.
Right.
And makes a complete Bible.
Yeah, and this is the first Bible sanctioned by a king.
Yeah, and if you notice, my chair's going to squeak. I'm trying to sit really still so it doesn't. My knee feels a lot better now that I've moved.
Now that you moved.
Notice how big this thing is.
Massive.
Okay, and so Tyndale's New Testament was made to be distributed.
Right. This was not. Yeah.
This is a history looks back on things. This was a segue. We know it now to be that.
Right.
Okay. But he took Tyndale's stuff. Here it is. It's massive. And tell us how, if you will, Brother Sluder, tell us how Miles Coverdale runs into John Rogers / Thomas Matthews.
Yeah, so again, I call this a quote-unquote segue Bible because this was not the first Bible authorized by a king, okay? The King James wasn't the first, but this was the first one sanctioned. Like, this is the first time where it's King Henry VIII, so you can see how quickly...
Yeah, you're talking about Coverdale.
Coverdale.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is... William Tyndale prays that prayer, right? And within a decade, you have the Coverdale Bible. It was sanctioned by the king. He did not get together and I want a Bible but permission was given to print this. You're not printing stuff in England without the king giving you permission to do it, right? So this is sanctioned by the king. So John Rogers was converted through William Tyndale, his convert William Tyndale. John Rogers took Miles Coverdale's Bible and he got a license from the king to basically have his way with this Bible here. Now, John Rogers, he gets a license from the king, but it's still really dangerous just to print the Bible. It's just, even though the king sanctioned him, even though this one was given a license, it's still risky business of being in the Bible translation and Bible printing ministry at that time, okay? So John Rogers does this Bible under the pseudonym of Thomas Matthews. All right, so this is called the Matthews Bible. And what's interesting is he puts, if I can find it quickly here, and again, so William Tyndale does his New Testament, and then the Coverdale Bible, and then the Matthews Bible is just kind of like a continuation of that William Tyndale Bible. And what's interesting is King Henry VIII burns William Tyndale alive, right?
Right.
But now you have converts of William Tyndale getting licenses from the King of England to do this Bible. So see if I can find it here. I may not be able to find the exact page on it. So what he does is he puts, let's see if I can, I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it, the exact place. Anyway, he puts the initials of there were these WM or WTs, excuse me, that he scattered throughout, and I wish I could remember where he put. I thought one might have been on the cover page of the New Testament, but he puts WTs everywhere, and what it stands for is William Tyndale. Yeah. And so, man, I wish I could find it, but anyway, and so this Bible is a testament to Tyndale, and his work that he did. So John Rogers, gets a license from the king. I'm going to have to refer to my notes on this one here from Bill Bradley's book. But William Tyndale, John Rogers is burnt at the stake. He ultimately dies for doing this work. Like I said, he gets a license from the king, but he dies.
He dies
because under Bloody Mary.
Mary.
Exactly. Not under King Henry VIII.
Yeah.
King Henry VIII comes out of power. Roman Catholic Bloody Mary comes in, and because he was known to use this Bible or to do this Bible, he's now burned at the stake because he went against the papal decree. And Bloody Mary's a Catholic queen. Mm-hmm. And so she she hated Protestants. She hated the Bibles, all that kind of stuff. And so his execution is February the 4th, 1555. Interestingly enough, the same year of the Stephanus Greek text that comes out, that gives us the basis for first divisions in the Bible. It's a little, I don't know. You said, what does that mean? What's the correlation? No idea. It's just interesting.
Yeah.
All right. But he becomes the first victim of Bloody Mary.
So we talked about Thomas Matthews, which is John Rogers. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now what comes next?
So next in line, John Rogers dies in 1555, February 4th, 1555, by the hands of Bloody Mary. Okay. So he's put to death. He's martyred. But before he's martyred, King Henry VIII is still in power. So here's where it gets really interesting, and I love how the Lord takes the wise in their own conceits and their own craftiness or whatever. King Henry VIII burns William Tyndale at the stake, like we said. Then Miles Coverdale does his Bible, 1535. It's sanctioned by the king. Then John Rogers gets a license from King Henry VIII, right? And John Rogers is a convert, like we said, of William Tyndale. So it's like this guy that's been put to death, now King Henry VIII all of a sudden is like, unknowingly all for the guy, not realizing this is, his converts and so forth and so on. So King Henry VIII, again, this is all leading up to what are we going to do with the English Bible? We're breaking away from the Catholic Church, so forth and so on. So now, 1539, King Henry VIII gets the Archbishop Cranmer, and he wants him to do a Bible. This is an officially authorized by the king Bible. So the King James was not the first one. Mm-hmm. Okay, this is the first one. This is the Great Bible. And this was done in 1539. They want an official translation to be chained to the pulpit. It was also called the Chained Bible. It's called the Great Bible because of its size. But they would chain them to the pulpits in the churches of England. And this was done by Miles Coverdale. He had already done one with his name on it. And like I said, he had to flee for his life 3 separate times. Never dies of martyr's death. But now he's being authorized by King Henry VIII to do a Bible for the churches of England.
Yeah. And it's interesting how political this thing was.
Very political.
Because King Henry VIII, as we've said before, was not a very sanctified person at all.
No.
And it's called the Chain Bible. Tyndale's New Testament was small and could easily be distributed. Mm-hmm. Not this one. It's chained to the pulpit. And it was illegal for this thing to be read outside of specific times, and by specific people.
Yeah.
And so the Great Bible, tell us how long the Great Bible stayed chained to the pulpits.
Oh, for a long, I say a long time, relatively speaking. When you're talking about English translations prior to the King James, it's almost kind of like, modern Bibles now. They don't stick around long. They get replaced. It was all the way up. So in 1546, King Henry VIII bans any Bible but the Great Bible. That's where you actually have a lot of the destruction of the Tyndale New Testaments. That's where, because I think there's very few. I think there's 3.
One of them is at the British Library.
Yeah.
At least it was.
3 whole ones, maybe, I'm thinking. I think I'm right about that. I could be wrong. I reserve the right to be wrong. But,
Okay.
but I think there's only three complete when the original William Tyndale New Testament's later.
Yeah, there's not many at all.
There's not many. And a lot of that happened in 1546 when King Henry VIII outlawed everything but the Great Bible. Okay? So again, we're talking about these translations coming along. Then you have Bloody Mary. We already talked about Bloody Mary because we went back to the future.
Yeah.
If I could quote the movie, and talked about the death of John Rogers under the hand of Bloody Mary. Well, that she comes into power after King Henry VIII is out of there. King Henry VIII comes to power, and Cranmer, who authorized this Bible, authorized Miles Coverdale through the king to do this Bible, he's put to death by Bloody Mary.
Yeah.
So,
he's the guy that stuck his hand in the fire first.
Oh, okay.
And because he said his hand had done things or written, so I forget what it was, but his hand had done bad things, and he stuck it in the fire first and then hopped in.
Wow.
That was Cranmer.
Yeah. So he dies, and the Great Bible. But this is what was so wonderful about the Great Bible. You could go into the church. It was chained to the pulpit. You could go into the church. Anybody could go in there and read. If you could read, you could walk into the church and read the Bible. But
not during Bloody Mary's reign.
Oh, no, of course not during the Bloody Mary's reign, because she was a Catholic.
Yeah.
So when she came into power, all of that stopped. Every bit of it stopped. And so there was, Bloody Mary wanted to destroy this, because again, there's still this, and this is where this is important to reiterate, there's still these papal decrees of you can't read the Bible unless it's in Latin, you can't produce it in English, because the Catholic Church was still wanting to control the Scriptures to keep those people in darkness.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, and that's what they've tried to do, and that's what they're still trying to do in other ways, obviously. So Bloody Mary gets on the throne, and you've got talking about the fires of Smithfield and the crazy barbaric stuff that was done in the name of Christ to people that were anti-Catholic. And so what's our next Bible to talk about? So
because of the reign of Bloody Mary, who she earned every bit of her name, right? Mm-hmm. Because of that, there was a group of men who went to Geneva, Switzerland, Calvin's country. The Pope of Geneva, as they called him.
The Pope of Protestantism.
The Protestantism, yes. And they did what's called the Geneva Bible. This was in 1560, is when it came out. And that was under the reign. So the Geneva Bible was done under the reign of Bloody Mary from Switzerland. So the Geneva Bible, it was a great Bible. It was done. But the problem, and the Geneva Bible is a really interesting Bible to point this out on. The Geneva Bible was kind of a testament to a translation being done by a bunch of men that all thought the same.
As exemplified by
the notes in there. The notes were extremely Calvinist leaning. They were extremely anti-Church of England, which is a good thing to do. It's good to be anti-Church of England, but you don't want to be so anti-Church of England that it affects your notes and even some of your translation work in the Bible, because you're trying to. It's like, let me give you an example. The Baptists in the 1800s, there was a book put out by the Baptists, a Bible put out by the Baptists, that changed the word baptism to immersion. Mm-hmm. And we were talking a little bit about him before. He has a funny sounding name, but he's a brilliant man. Octavius Winslow was a Baptist preacher that put out a defense of the Authorized version and defended the use of baptism over the term immersion. Well, those Baptists thought, well, man, if we just translate this as immersion, change it to immersion, it ends the debate on the mode of baptism. Okay, they had the right idea, they had the right doctrine, but they wanted to change the Bible to fit it.
That goes all the way back to Origen.
Right.
Changing the Bible to try to fit positions.
Exactly. So was it right to stand against the Church of England? Yes. You don't change the Bible to do it, though. Let the Bible stand. Let the Bible speak for itself, right? But anyway, so the Geneva Bible was done by one group of men, an extremely anti-Church of England Protestant group, and they did the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible, and there was another one done in 1599, if I remember that correctly. And it was a good Bible. It was very popular. It's the Bible, quote unquote, of the Pilgrims, right? It's the one that was brought over, so forth and so on. But it was done, and that was one of the reasons. Every Bible leading up to the King James was either done by one man or one group of men
that were very
aligning
in their beliefs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there was, and Brother Canup and I talked about this. I think it was Brother Canup, not too awful long ago, about pretty much 50 years prior to the King James Bible coming out and 50 years after. The Geneva Bible was basically the Bible of the people. And I know we're fixing to talk about the Bishop's Bible, but the Geneva Bible was the one that the people accepted and used. And obviously there was a lot of good done from it, but some of the text in the Geneva Bible was flat out wrong. 2 Samuel 21:19 with David there. Everybody knows David killed Goliath, but some of the false Bibles, and I think they may have changed that recently with some, but
NIV did,
but the ESV different ones talking about that. I believe it was Elhanan, the brother of is taken out.
Right, and it says Elhanan killed Goliath.
Yeah, Elhanan killed Goliath. Well, people, that's wrong. That's not King James. That's perverting the Bible. That's a Geneva reading.
Yeah.
From the Geneva Bible.
Yeah, that's not a critical text reading. That was, we talked about that. We did.
On that one when we talked about italics.
We did.
But yeah, that was a Geneva deal.
It was. The Geneva Bible, was a good Bible, don't get me wrong. It was definitely from the right text and stuff like that. But you really started to see with the Geneva, because the Geneva Bible, and I misspoke here just a second ago, not a bad misspeaking. The Geneva Bible was the first Bible produced by a group, a committee of men. Okay? It wasn't the first, or it wasn't the last before the King James, because we're going to talk about the Bishop's Bible next. But the Geneva Bible was a group of men. It was Theodore Beza, it was John Knox, it was, and then Fox that did the Fox's Book of Martyrs.
Yeah, John Fox.
John Fox. John Knox, John Fox.
Not the former coach of the Panthers.
No, not him.
Yeah.
That would have been interesting.
Different John Fox.
Different John Fox. Theodore Beza. They head up this committee. Okay. The Geneva Bible is also a good Bible for a lot of reasons. It was the first Bible to use the first English Bible to use verse divisions. So that was a big deal. It was the first Bible to use italics in there. All right, the actual use of italics is where the King James translators got it from. So the Geneva Bible, it had its perks. But again, the biggest problem with the Geneva Bible, and this is where I really think the Lord started seeing, the Lord started seeing, we start seeing the Lord start pulling this idea of, okay, all of them were by one man. Then the next two, the Geneva and the Bishops, were by committees of very like-minded men that had slants that they wanted in there. And of course, the King James being a mixture of all that. Even though they were all Church of England, they still had different theological groups.
Yeah, because you had Puritans in there.
Exactly. So the Geneva Bible actually came back into popularity a couple of years ago, even so much that Brother Gipp put a book out on it.
About the Trojan horse.
Because it was a great Bible. It was the Bible of the people. It was very popular. And there's this whole idea where, the King James wasn't very popular when it first came out. It took years and years for it to go in popularity over the Geneva. Well, that's not true. When a king says you're using this one, you're using that one.
Yeah, 50-year transition, you could probably put it that way.
And some would argue that that's even a stretch. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But so this is the Geneva Bible, and this is just a beautiful Bible with the facsimile copy. I mean, this was it wasn't overly ornate. It was a simple read. It just I love looking at the Geneva, but you can see again bearing out the testimony of it. You can see it is loaded with notes. It is just absolutely loaded with stuff in there. So it's like you can see how it would cause problems. This is the Apocrypha. You can see how it would cause problems with people because of all the notes in there not agreeing.
It's just like any study Bible today. That's essentially what it was a study Bible.
It was a study Bible. And the King James translators had notes in there too, but nothing like what the Geneva, the Geneva and Calvinists did with the Geneva Bible.
Yeah.
So, but it was a good Bible. It was a good Bible.
Yeah. So why did they make the Bishop's Bible? Since that's our next one. I think that's the biggest one.
This one's huge. This is a big Bible. This is the Bishop's Bible. This was done 1568, and very ornate, very. This is a high church Bible. This is what this is. This was done by the bishops of the Church of England. And this is technically what the King James came from. The sanction of King James, and this is so big, I'm having a hard time. There we go. I promise I'm not weak. This thing is huge. I mean, this is big. So the official committee of the King James, the official rule was the King James is going to be a revision of the Bishop's Bible.
Right. Bishop Bancroft's 15 rules translating the Bible.
That's exactly right.
I'll pull it up here while you're talking.
Okay. It's also in Vance's new book. You can probably find it quicker than I can, though. So, with the Bishop's Bible, this Bible was done by the bishops of the Church of England, and it's the same problems with the Geneva Bible as far as it's just all out of one group of guys that all had these bents. It was almost done in response to the Geneva Bible. It was done in response. It was like a clapback from the bishops of England, saying, "Hey, this is the official Bible here."
So with the Bishop's Bible, how did that come into play since the Geneva Bible was the Bible of the people? Why did they make the Bishop's Bible?
They made the Bishop's Bible so Queen Elizabeth gave permission to the bishops of England to do a Bible in England on English soil for the English people. Because like we said, the Geneva Bible was done out in Geneva, in Switzerland. So they did the Bishop's Bible. It was produced completely by the Church of England, so it had those slants like we talked about. It had those high church Anglican slants in it, just like the Geneva had the Puritan, quote, slants. But the problem is it never gained popularity. The Bishop's Bible was never popular amongst the people. The Geneva Bible stayed in popularity.
Yeah. It says where the word of a king is, there's power, not the word of a queen.
That's a great point. So it was never popular. The people never took a hold of it. Even though I do believe they had pure intentions of making it, they wanted a Bible on English soil, it never grew in popularity. So 1576, Queen Elizabeth allows the Geneva Bible to be printed in England, which was a huge deal. Yeah. It was a huge deal. And the people loved that. So, and Queen Elizabeth was a wise king, or excuse me.
She was a wise queen.
In today's society, a wise queen. And she religious liberty had flourishing moments under Queen Elizabeth for sure. Especially compared to the reign of her predecessor, Bloody Queen Mary. So the Bishop's Bible, and like we were talking about, and you have the rule, Bancroft rules, right?
Yeah. So this is with the translation of the King James Bible.
Yeah.
And so one big thing about this big Bible is the role it played with the King James Bible. And so the first rule, and these are the rules to be observed in translation of the Bible by Bishop Bancroft, which is, he was the Archbishop or the Bishop of Canterbury, or was the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Archbishop of Canterbury.
He was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And here's the first rule. The ordinary Bible read in the church commonly called the Bishop's Bible to be followed and as little altered as the truth of the original will permit. So the basis for the King James Bible, the main base, is the Bishop's Bible.
Right.
And so that's probably the biggest thing to know about the Bishop's Bible, is the fact that it's of its role in the translation of the King James Bible. Now, we've already talked. Did you have anything else on the Bishop's Bible that you wanted to say?
No.
Okay. You want to go ahead and swap them out.
Go ahead and swap out the King James.
You need any help carrying this?
Oh my goodness! Whoa! I wish people could get lift that up. You're stronger than I am probably, but that's nothing light there. That's probably all of 45 pounds there.
It's beefy, that's for sure.
It is. All right.
So this is
the monarch of the books.
Yeah.
This is a King James. This particular edition that I have, there it is. It's the 1611, facsimile. This was done in 2011, though, in Italy. And it is one of only 1,500, so this is number 1202. This is a facsimile of the first impression of the original 1611 edition of the King James Bible. Was produced for the World Publishing Company, I'll spare you all that, of Ohio, by George Rainbird Limited, 2 Hyde Park, London. It is one of an edition limited to 1,500 copies, of which this is number 1202. It was printed by Offset Lithography and bound by Amilcar Pizzi, and that was done in Milan. All right. The laid paper was specifically made by the Ventura Mill at, however you say that word. The binding is a faithful replica of the original contemporary binding. The coat of arms on the slip case, which is over there, is that of the King James I, and this was printed in Italy. So this was the binding, everything. This is about as close to an original King James that you can get without it being an original.
Yeah.
So this is this is a high quality replica of what the King James would have looked like.
Yeah, and this, when we first opened it up, there's a lot to be said about this, because the first edition has gotten attacked from a few different angles. It's gotten attacked with some of the pictures in there, trying to say, and I don't want to open up a can of worms that I can't close right now, because Brother Knupp and I will probably do a podcast on this. But I'll just say there's some controversy with the pictures in there. Obviously, this one has the Apocrypha between the Testaments.
Right.
And one thing about the first edition of the King James Bible, the Apocrypha was not part of the text. It was stuck in between the Testaments, in between the Old Testament and New Testament, to be read, but not as part of the text. So when somebody says, the King James Bible had the Apocrypha in it, yeah, it did, but they made sure that it was not part of the text. Unlike Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which are the cornerstones of the New Bible versions, they have the Apocrypha mixed in the Old Testament in Vaticanus, and there's some in the New Testament in Sinaiticus, apocryphal books, as part of the canon of Scripture, which we know that that's not canon if it contains Apocrypha. And we've talked about this before, but in the Apocrypha is where the Catholic Church gets some of its doctrines, or some of its, some quote-unquote proof, if you will, for some of the stuff they believe. And so, but that's something to be noted, that reading for historical purposes and reading as part of the canon of Scripture is two totally distinct things, and it was made distinct in the original edition of the 1611 King James Bible. And notice how I worded that. It's the original edition of the 1611 King James Bible. Okay? We have here, I have, this is a reference Bible. This is a Ruttman reference Bible. But this is a 1611 King James Bible. But it's not the first edition of the 1611 King James Bible. Just to clear that up. So anyway, go ahead.
King James himself, in his book, the Basilicon Duran, he writes that he's no papist and that he doesn't count the Apocrypha as inspired. He doesn't think they're of Scripture. So, they recognize them for their historical value, and I do think there is some historical value to the Apocrypha, obviously. Not enough for me to put it in my Bible. And it does have contradictions in there. I mean, there are historical contradictions.
Oh, yeah.
But the argument of the King James had the Apocrypha is such a weak argument. And it is kind of like bringing like a rock to a gunfight. It's like, we have so much ammunition on why the modern Bibles are bad, and then all of a sudden they want to throw a rock and say, yeah, but the King James had the Apocrypha, while we've got a pistol.
Which is one of those leaving the truth out, a half-truth.
It's a half-truth, absolutely.
With Sinaiticus and Vaticanus.
Yeah, because they had the Apocrypha.
And the dishonesty there, because if they were honest, they would put the Apocrypha in the Testament, in the NIV and the NASB, which is now the LSB, and the ESV. They would put the Apocrypha in the Testament if they were honest.
Right.
But no, they have to pawn it off to look like the King James in order to sell it.
Absolutely. So,
and people can find more on the Apocrypha if they look up on the 1611 Defense YouTube channel, on YouTube Shorts. There was at least one, maybe two done on the Apocrypha, if any of you guys want to look at that. So anyway, go ahead.
No, so King James, 1604, a guy by the name of John Reynolds approaches King James about, hey, let's do this work. They have the Hampton Court. It's determined that they want to do this translation work. It is 54, if I'm getting that number right, 54 men. Some of them die in different things or, leave, whatever. But it's 54 men originally, and they're commissioned. They have six committees, and they're each assigned a portion of Scripture, and they would swap. It was a very rigorous threat. They were not all of one persuasion or one, clique or whatever. That was a very diverse group, and they were brilliant. The English language was at its peak. And King James commissions this work. People say, they love to rail accusations against King James. He's a homosexual, which that didn't come around until 25 years after he's dead.
Yeah.
But there's all that stuff by I think it was what was the guy's name? Ramsey or Sir Weldon? Weldon.
Yeah, Sir Anthony Weldon.
Sir Anthony Weldon. Weldon. And but the thing about it is they say, well, King James, he influenced the Bible. Well, number one, he did not translate the Bible. King James did not have his hand in the translation work. Although I will say this, if he did, he was just as qualified to do so because of his education that he received in Scotland. King James was a brilliant man.
Yeah.
He really was. So he didn't have his hand in there, but if he did have his hand, he was just as qualified to do so. And that's what people don't realize. So it was done. And this is an interesting thing, of course. Remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I have no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot.
Yeah.
They tried to blow up Parliament with King James because of the work of the translation of the King James Bible.
Yeah, and that was a Jesuit plot.
Absolutely it was.
And just like, the Jesuits have been around trying to get rid of, they would love to get rid of the King James Bible.
Oh, they hate it.
And they knew that it was, there's a reason that the Lord had mercy on England and on us because we have the King James Bible with the Guy Fawkes plot. And we had, there's the Guy Fawkes mask that people have today.
Yeah.
You see them sometimes in cars and stuff.
Well, the famous movie V for Vendetta That guy was wearing the John Fawkes mask, and he ended up in that movie.
The Guy Fawkes mask, yeah.
Yeah, was that what it is? Yeah, Guy Fawkes, and he ended up blowing up Parliament in that movie, or so I've been told. But, that was a plot of his, and he got it from Guy Fawkes, and Guy Fawkes is celebrated as this hero amongst a lot of people. He was trying to bring down the British, dictatorship of King James. King James was a staunch believer in the divine right of kings.
Yeah.
He was a very strong leader. And he was a very religious man. He was a very godly man. And,
he was weird too.
He was a weirdo.
He was odd. And some of the accusations against him, we probably be a good idea to do a podcast on King James at some point.
Yeah.
But some of the accusations against him are just founded wrongfully. But he was weird.
He was paranoid. Number one, he was paranoid about being killed.
Well, there was seeing how he grew up.
Exactly.
And seeing the assassinations and assassination attempts that he lived through.
Yeah, attempted kidnaps, the whole 9 yards. The dude was paranoid that somebody was out to get him, and they were. It was the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And so he would sleep. He had 2 bodyguards. One slept on this side, one slept on that side. I mean, heck, if somebody was trying to kill me, I'd have a circle around the bed or something. I'd be paranoid too. So a lot of that stemmed from that, and it was just, he was not in the bed with men in that way. He just had bodyguards. And by the way, it was very common for that at that time period. That was commonplace for kings their bodyguards were their bodyguards. They didn't have the technology and the surveillance we have now. You had to be right there with them.
Yeah.
But besides all that, he was a man of integrity, a man of character. He believed in the divine right of kings, and he believed that the Bible was God's words. I mean, you read what he wrote. He was a believer in the Scriptures. And so, the Catholic Church is trying to kill him with the gunpowder plot. They realize, and this is what's interesting, this is kind of, I don't have a facsimile of this, but this is kind of interesting when you're referring to the King James. You can hardly bring up the King James or even the history of the English Bible without mentioning a English Bible that was done in 1610, 1 year before the King James came out, and that was the Douay-Rheims. That was an English Bible put out by the Catholic Church. They realized they had lost the battle for the English Bible. They realized that they were not going to keep people reading Latin.
Right.
They were not going to be able to keep Latin in their churches and in their pulpits, and people were going to have access to the Bible. So they came up with the Douay-Rheims version. It was a counter-Reformation product. The counter-Reformation is exactly what it sounds like. It's a counter movement to the Reformation to try to keep the Catholic Church in power. And they put out an English Bible called the Douay-Rheims translation, which was a translation from the Latin Vulgate into English. And that was their attempt, and it didn't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the New Testament was out 30 years earlier, so
right.
28 years, when, 1582. And it was
so unpopular there was no Old Testament needed.
Well, there's basically, when you look at the Douay-Rheims, the way I look at it is it's a Jesuit attempt to counterbalance what was happening.
Right.
Because you had the Geneva being the big Bible on the spot in 1582. But when the King James Bible came in, obviously right before the Old Testament gets published, right before the King James Bible is published. And so Rome was always out to get the Scriptures imitated. Okay, and there's a difference between imitate and follow, and you can read that from where we're to follow Jesus Christ, not imitate Him, because imitate is an outward show, whereas follow is done, that's more of the heart too, not just the outward show. And so, but what Satan has done ever since Genesis 3 is question the Word of God. Yeah. And when the Catholics put out the Douay-Rheims in 1582, and of course Old Testament later, 1609, 1610, that was very important in the history of the English Bible if you lead it all the way up to today. Mm-hmm. Because you have some Catholic connections with Sinaiticus.
Absolutely.
And obviously Vaticanus, the Vatican manuscript.
The Book of the Vatican has Catholic connections.
And then how quickly they started getting put out there from a standpoint of time. You know, with Sinaiticus being quote unquote discovered, and then Vaticanus coming on the scene, even though it had been around for a while. And then that set the stage for Westcott and Hort, which set the stage for all the modern Bibles we have today. And so when you think of history of the English Bible, we've been talking about the history of what God has used to get people saved and using to put His words out. And then you have the Catholic counter to that with the 1582 Rheims, Douay-Rheims, and then all the way to today where you have Catholic Bibles that are pawned off as Protestant Bibles, like the Legacy Standard Bible, the ESV, and the NIV. And people say, well, that's not a Catholic Bible. It comes from a Catholic text.
Comes from a Catholic text. Absolutely. And this is where...
Including the JW Bible.
New World Translation. Absolutely.
NWT.
So, and this is where I think it kind of comes full circle to our conversation. You know, when you study the history of the English Bible, you know, it's this old argument, well, the Catholics gave us the Bible, you know, the missing books, and they decided what was left in and what's up. The Catholics did not give us the Bible. Even if you study by 325, the Council of Nicaea, the canon of Scripture was not even a discussion then. They were not even discussing the canon of Scripture at the Council of Nicaea. Well, the Catholic Church gave us the Bible. No, they didn't. And you know how I know, just even from a practical perspective, you know how I know the Catholic Church didn't give us the Bible? Because they fought for centuries to keep it from us. So that's how I know they didn't give it to us. No, the Catholic Church didn't give us the Bible. They fought for centuries so that for the fact that we wouldn't have it.
Well, by the time the Council of Carthage came along, the books that are in the Bible, I forgot it starts with an H, but anyway, those books were becoming the standard for the canon because of usage.
Absolutely.
They didn't have to have some council to stamp approval on it.
Even Athanasius mentions the canon of Scripture and lists, so and that's a whole other argument, a whole other can of worms, whole other podcast. But, the Catholic Church realized they couldn't keep the Bible from us anymore. So what did they do?
Change it.
They had
duplicate it with changes.
Right. They had to. Okay. Well, let us give you a Bible. Let us give you a Bible. Yeah. Don't take it from these guys. Let us give you one. Here it is, and it's corrupt. So the King James, and here's what I'll say about the King James. Going back to just the history of the English Bible, you have, and I mentioned this earlier in the podcast. Hours and hours ago, however long this podcast has gone at this point now, but you have 1380. The first complete English Bible, the Wycliffe Bible, 1382. 150 years until the next one with William Tyndale's New Testament. We can now print Bibles. Then you have this very rapid succession of Bibles. Boom, 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 boom. The Tyndale, Coverdale, Matthews, great, whatever. The Tyndale, Coverdale, Matthews, Great Bible, so forth and so on. My brain is not wanting to work right now. Geneva, bishops, and then King James. All in less than a century. Okay, now tell me what the next major Bible translation was after the King James.
Yeah, Revised Version.
1881 is the next one. There were several attempts, even quote unquote TR Bibles that were done. Noah Webster even did his own, whatever.
Yeah.
No, but people...
the main ones.
Yeah. Some people don't even realize that Noah Webster did a Bible. There was a woman in the 1800s that did her own translation.
Darby did one.
John Nelson Darby did one. Nobody remembers that. Joseph Smith did one. I mean, there's been translations of the Bible. Nobody hardly even knows about them. You know why? Because for 250-something years, whatever the exact math is, even longer than that, I should say, you have one book reign supreme. And so when you study the history of the English Bible, not only is it a testament to how God just worked these things and was really putting things into play to get us to the King James, but when you study the history of the English Bible, you see this drop off, boom, immediately. Nobody sees a need. People say, oh, the King James translators, they didn't think that their translation was the final one. They saw a need of continuing translations. Okay, well, somehow for 270 years of church history, nobody else thought that.
Well, the thing about it is, Daniel didn't understand everything he was prophesying.
Right.
The King James translators were a lot more honest than people think. They're a lot more honest than the new version translators in a lot of ways. Depending on how, and there's different ways of looking at it. Brother Knupp and I did a podcast a little bit ago on that, maybe 2 or 3 ago. But it's the motive for putting the scriptures out today is way different. Just Absolutely. If you look at the backdrops and everything. And the Lord has blessed us with not just a Bible, but the Bible.
Yeah.
And it culminated with God's crowning work in the King James Bible. And if anybody wants to know if it's, if God had His hand in it, just look at the history of revivals. And look at the history of revivals after the body of Christ started using new, perverted, Protestant, quote-unquote, Bibles that are actually Catholic Bibles because of the text they came from.
Right.
The Revised Version, Revised Standard Version, which people knew that one was liberal anyway, the RSV. And that's even the name of a virus. But you got the RSV, the NIV, the NASB, all this CEV, all this stuff coming from Catholic Greek.
Yeah.
And that's not even talking about the Old Testament. Catholic Old Testaments as well. So I'm really glad that the Lord let us do this podcast, brother, and I hope it's been helpful to our listeners or to the listeners of the podcast. It's really neat, this collection you got.
Amen.
And I'm glad the Lord has blessed you with it, and thank you for letting me come up here and do this podcast with you. Before we close out, any final comments?
If any church is interested in having, we got the displays. I don't know if we can see it from the cameras, but this is just one of the folios. This is the King James Bible folio. We have these displays that we set up along with these Bibles. If any church is interested in having this display in the church, if they'd like to have a Sunday night or a 3-day meeting or something like that, or even a one-night Saturday night, whatever. Where we come in and set these up and go through this information and delve into different aspects of deeper whatever the pastor wants. We travel. This display travels.
Today was a very brief summary of it.
Yes.
And it was definitely not too detailed.
Right.
Because we covered so much in, just kind of breezing over it. But so, Brother Sluder, we have talked before about some books you've written, and Brother Sluder's got a good book on Calvinism. It's against Calvinism.
Yeah, it's against it.
Just so everybody knows.
Horrible book for it.
yeah. But anyway, got some other works and has the Bible College, and we talked about that last time.
Right.
And Brother Sluder, thanks for being on the podcast, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, praise the Lord. Thank you for having me.
All right, thanks.